At 61 years old, Evelyn Brooks locked the front door of her family's general store for the very last time. For more than 90 years, 3 generations of her family had served the town from that little shop. But they couldn't compete with the giant chain stores that had slowly emptied their aisles and taken away their customers. With only 100 left that she could afford to spend, Evelyn made a decision everyone called foolish. Instead of saving the money, she bought an abandoned community hall that had been sitting empty for decades. People shook their heads, saying she'd traded one failed building for another. Some even laughed, wondering why a woman who had just lost everything would waste her last dollars on a place everyone else wanted demolished. A few weeks later, while removing loose floorboards beneath the old speaker's podium, Evelyn uncovered a hidden wooden compartment that had clearly been opened many times long after the hall was supposedly abandoned. Inside was a weathered chest filled with faded documents and one handwritten note that ended with 6 astonishing words. The charter was never lost. What she discovered next would rewrite the history of an entire town. But before we uncover that remarkable journey, I'd love to know where you're listening from today and what time it is where you are. Leave a comment below to say hello. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories about forgotten communities, hidden family legacies, and remarkable discoveries, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story. Wherever you are in the world, I hope you're having a wonderful day. And now, let's go back to the moment Evelyn closed the last door of her family's business. Evelyn Brooks stood quietly inside Brooks' General Store long before sunrise, listening to the familiar hum of the old refrigerators one final time. For more than 90 years, the little store had opened before dawn, welcoming farmers, teachers, mechanics, and families who stopped in for coffee, fresh bread, or simply a friendly conversation before beginning their day. Her grandfather had unlocked these same doors when the town was little more than a handful of streets. Her father had expanded the shelves after returning home from military service. Evelyn herself had spent more than 40 years behind the worn wooden counter, learning the names of children who later returned with children of their own. Now, at 61, she was preparing to close the family's business forever. She walked slowly through the quiet aisles, her fingertips brushing across nearly empty shelves. Most of the inventory had already been sold during the clearance sale. Only a few canned goods, greeting cards, and bags of flour remained. The old cash register still sat proudly on the counter beside a faded photograph of her late husband, Thomas, smiling during the store's 75th anniversary celebration. Evelyn picked up the picture and smiled gently. "We gave it our best," she whispered. Outside, the first customers of the day began arriving, though today they came more to say goodbye than to shop. Mrs. Henderson, who had bought groceries there every Friday for nearly 30 years, stepped inside carrying a homemade pie instead of a shopping basket. "You shouldn't have," Evelyn said warmly. "Neither should you," the older woman replied, looking around the nearly empty store. "This town won't feel the same without this place." Soon others followed. A retired firefighter stopped by to shake Evelyn's hand. A young mother thanked her for quietly extending credit years earlier when money had been tight. 2 former high school students, now adults, laughed about spending their allowance on candy after school. None of them bought much. They came because they wanted to say farewell to a place that had quietly become part of their lives. Around midday, the bell above the front door rang one last time. A young boy entered with his father. Clutching $2 in his hand, he carefully chose a chocolate bar from the nearly empty display beside the register. Evelyn smiled as she rang up the purchase. "That'll be $1.50. The boy handed her the money, then looked around curiously. "My dad says this store's closing." Evelyn nodded gently. "It is. Who's going to sell candy now?" His innocent question drew a quiet laugh from everyone nearby. His father rested a hand on the boy's shoulder. "We'll find candy somewhere else." The child looked back at Evelyn. "But it won't be this store." After they left, Evelyn stood silently for several moments. Children always had a way of saying the simplest truths. Late that afternoon, she counted the final receipts and locked the old cash register for the last time. The numbers confirmed what she had known for months. The chain supermarket that had opened outside town had steadily drawn away customers. Rising costs had done the rest. She had delayed the decision as long as possible, hoping business might somehow recover. But hope alone could no longer pay suppliers or utility bills. She turned the sign on the front door from open to closed, then carefully removed it from the glass altogether. Her hand lingered on the brass doorknob before she locked it. The sound of the key turning echoed more loudly than she expected. Across the street, several neighbors quietly applauded. It wasn't applause for failure. It was gratitude for everything the little store had meant. Evelyn smiled through moist eyes and waved before carrying one final cardboard box to her aging pickup truck. Inside were family photographs, the store ledger her grandfather had started decades earlier, and the small wooden nameplate that had rested above the register for as long as she could remember. She drove away without looking back until the building disappeared behind a row of maple trees. The following morning, Evelyn visited the county office to complete one final piece of unfinished business. Weeks earlier, she had noticed a notice posted on the community bulletin board announcing the auction of the abandoned community hall. Once the heart of town meetings, holiday dinners, school performances, and charity events. The old building had sat empty for years after maintenance costs became too expensive. The town council planned to sell it rather than continue paying for repairs. Bidding had attracted almost no interest. Most people believed the aging structure was beyond saving. Evelyn had quietly submitted the minimum offer of $100. She had no grand plan. She simply couldn't bear the thought of watching another piece of the town disappear. The clerk smiled as he handed her an envelope. "Congratulations, Mrs. Brooks, the community hall is officially yours." Evelyn looked down at the heavy brass key resting inside. "Just $100, she said softly, almost to herself. "Sometimes that's all it takes," the clerk replied kindly. News traveled quickly through the small town. By the time Evelyn stopped for coffee, several familiar faces had already heard about the purchase. "You really bought that old place?" one man asked with disbelief. "I did." He shook his head. "After losing the store seems like throwing good money after bad." Another neighbor sighed sympathetically. "That building's been empty for years. The roof leaks, windows are broken. It'll cost more than it's worth." Evelyn simply smiled. "Maybe, but somebody should care enough to try." She drove toward the edge of town where the old community hall stood beneath towering oak trees. The white paint had long since faded to gray, and vines climbed one side of the weathered walls. Several windows were cracked, while weeds covered the stone walkway leading to the entrance. Yet beneath the years of neglect, she could still recognize the building she remembered from childhood. She had attended school plays there, community dinners, Christmas concerts. Her own wedding reception had filled the large hall with music and laughter decades earlier. Unlocking the front door felt strangely familiar. The hinges groaned as the heavy wooden door slowly opened. Dust floated through beams of afternoon sunlight pouring across the empty room. Rows of folding chairs leaned against one wall. A faded American flag stood forgotten in one corner. At the far end of the hall remained the old wooden stage where generations of local children had once performed. Evelyn walked slowly across the creaking floor, memories returning with every step. She climbed onto the stage and stood behind the worn speaker's podium, running her hand across its smooth surface.
She smiled as she remembered watching her father deliver speeches during harvest festivals. Then something caught her attention. Near the base of the podium, one section of the wooden floor looked slightly different from the surrounding boards.
Kneeling carefully, Evelyn brushed away years of dust. The narrow panel showed faint scratches around its edges, as though it had been lifted and replaced many times before finally being forgotten. The following morning, Evelyn Brooks returned to the community hall carrying a broom, a toolbox, several cleaning supplies, and the homemade pie Mrs. Henderson had insisted she take home after the store closed. The building looked no less worn beneath the bright morning sun, yet she no longer saw it as an abandoned property. It was simply a place that had been waiting too long for someone to unlock its front door again. She stepped inside and opened every window that still worked, allowing cool autumn air to drift through the hall. Dust swirled in the sunlight as she slowly swept years of dirt toward the entrance. Every few minutes, she paused to study another familiar corner. She remembered decorating the stage for Christmas pageants, helping organize charity dinners after spring floods, and watching local school bands perform where only silence remained now. The building felt empty, but never lifeless. It still carried echoes of the people who had gathered there. By mid-morning, she heard the sound of a pickup truck pulling into the gravel parking lot. A tall man in work boots climbed out, carrying a wooden toolbox across one shoulder. "Mrs. Brooks?" he called from the doorway. Evelyn smiled politely. "You must be Noah Ellis." "That's me." He looked around the hall before letting out a low whistle. "She's got good bones." Evelyn laughed softly. "Most people have been telling me the exact opposite." Noah shrugged. "I've repaired enough old buildings to know appearances can be misleading." He walked slowly through the hall, studying cracked windows, loose boards, and the aging roof visible through water stains on the ceiling. The roof needs attention before winter, and a few support beams should be reinforced. "It'll take work." He smiled reassuringly, "but nothing here says it can't be saved." Those simple words lifted Evelyn's spirits more than she expected. "That's the first encouraging thing I've heard all week." Noah set down his toolbox and immediately began removing damaged trim around one of the front windows. Evelyn continued cleaning nearby while they talked. Noah had grown up in town and remembered attending community dances inside the hall as a teenager. "My grandmother used to say every important decision in this town happened under this roof," he said while measuring a window frame. "Birth celebrations, elections, fundraisers, harvest dinners, everything." Evelyn nodded. "That's why I couldn't watch it disappear as the morning passed." They uncovered more small reminders of the building's past. Beneath stacked chairs, they found handmade signs from old festivals. Inside a storage closet lay folded tablecloths embroidered by local volunteers decades earlier. Nothing held monetary value, but every object carried traces of the people who had once filled the hall with life. Around lunchtime, Noah asked, "Have you looked under that loose floor panel you mentioned yesterday?" Evelyn shook her head. "I thought I'd wait until someone stronger than me was here." They carried a small pry bar onto the stage and knelt beside the worn speaker's podium. Up close, the scratches surrounding the narrow wooden panel looked even more noticeable. Whoever had lifted it in the past had done so repeatedly, though carefully enough that the opening blended into the surrounding floor. Noah slid the pry bar beneath one edge. After a little effort, the panel lifted just enough for both of them to remove it completely. They expected to find an empty storage space beneath. Instead, they discovered a neatly built wooden compartment recessed below the floorboards. Dust covered everything except one corner where the wood appeared noticeably cleaner. Noah frowned. "That's odd." Evelyn leaned closer. "Someone's been in here." The compartment itself contained nothing except a thin layer of dust, but several faint scrape marks crossed the bottom as though a small object had once rested there before being removed. More surprising still, the dust did not cover those marks completely. "This wasn't disturbed recently," Noah said thoughtfully. "But it definitely wasn't left untouched since the hall closed." Evelyn looked around the silent room. "I thought everyone believed this place had been empty for years." Noah slowly replaced the floor panel beside the opening instead of covering it again. Maybe empty isn't the same as forgotten. They spent the afternoon repairing broken shelves in the storage room and removing damaged ceiling plaster. While moving an old oak cabinet away from the side wall, something small rolled across the wooden floor with a soft, metallic sound. Evelyn bent down and picked it up. Resting in her palm was a tarnished brass key no longer than 2 inches. Time had darkened the metal, but one side still showed a small engraved symbol resembling the outline of the community hall. "That certainly doesn't belong to a modern lock," Noah observed. Evelyn turned it over carefully. "No numbers? No labels?" She slipped it into her pocket for safekeeping. Later that afternoon, she decided to visit Grace Whitman, the retired librarian who had spent decades preserving local history. Grace welcomed her warmly into a cozy home filled with overflowing bookshelves and framed historical photographs. When Evelyn mentioned purchasing the community hall, Grace's eyes brightened immediately. "I've always hoped someone would save that building," she admitted. Evelyn described the loose floor panel, the hidden compartment, and the mysterious brass key. Grace listened carefully before disappearing into another room. She returned carrying an old scrapbook filled with newspaper clippings and faded photographs of community events. Several pages showed the hall during its busiest years. "This building wasn't just a meeting place," Grace explained. "It was the heart of the town." Evelyn carefully studied one photograph showing residents gathered around the speaker's podium during the town's centennial celebration. "Do you know anything about hidden compartments?" Grace smiled thoughtfully. "Only stories." "Stories?" Old-timers used to whisper that important town records were sometimes stored inside the hall when the courthouse was too small. She shrugged gently.
No one ever proved it.
Evelyn showed her the brass key. Grace adjusted her glasses before examining it closely. "I've never seen this key before." She paused. "But I do remember hearing that the original speaker's podium had a locked storage compartment beneath it." Evelyn's heart quickened. "The one under the stage," Grace nodded slowly. "If the stories were true." Evening shadows stretched across the quiet community hall as Evelyn and Noah returned to the stage carrying the old brass key. The hidden compartment remained open exactly as they had left it. Noah carefully examined its wooden sides with a flashlight until he noticed a small brass plate almost invisible beneath decades of dust. He brushed it clean with his sleeve, revealing a tiny keyhole cleverly built into the back wall of the compartment. Evelyn reached into her pocket, wrapped her fingers around the tarnished brass key, and slowly guided it toward the hidden lock. Evelyn Brooks held the tarnished brass key between her fingers for a moment before carefully sliding it into the hidden keyhole inside the compartment beneath the speaker's podium. The metal resisted slightly, then settled into place with surprising precision. Noah Ellis knelt beside her, shining his flashlight toward the back of the narrow space. "Looks like it belongs there," he said quietly. Evelyn turned the key. A soft click echoed beneath the wooden floor. Neither of them spoke for a second. The sound was unmistakable. Something inside the compartment had unlocked. Noah reached into the opening and gently pulled on what looked like the edge of a thin wooden panel. Slowly it slid forward, revealing a small hidden drawer no wider than a briefcase. Dust drifted into the air as the drawer opened completely. Resting inside was a weathered cedar chest no larger than a bread box. Its brass corners had darkened with age, but the wood itself remained remarkably well preserved. "That's been here a long time," Noah whispered. Evelyn carefully lifted the chest onto the stage. It felt lighter than she expected. There was no lock, only a simple brass latch that opened easily beneath her thumb. Both leaned forward as the lid slowly rose. There were no gold coins, no jewelry, no deeds to valuable land. Instead, the chest held neatly stacked bundles of folded papers tied with faded blue ribbon. A few handwritten notebooks rested beneath them, besides several carefully folded documents protected inside waxed paper. Evelyn gently lifted the first bundle. The pages contained meeting minutes written in careful handwriting. Across the top of the oldest sheet appeared the words, "Community Assembly Proceedings." Dates stretching back more than 100 years filled the margins. Noah looked over her shoulder. "Town meetings?" Evelyn nodded as she turned another page. The records described discussions about building roads, organizing harvest festivals, supporting families after harsh winters, and raising money for a small school. Every decision had been recorded by hand, along with the names of citizens who attended. She smiled softly. This is the town learning how to become a community. Beneath the meeting records lay another bundle tied with string. These papers listed the names of the earliest residents who had settled the valley. Beside many names were simple notes identifying occupations: blacksmith, teacher, carpenter, doctor, farmer, baker. Some family names still existed in town today. Evelyn immediately recognized Henderson, Whitman, Ellis, Price, and Brooks among the earliest settlers. "Look," she said quietly, pointing toward one page. Noah smiled. "Your family was here from the beginning." Evelyn traced her great-grandfather's surname with one finger. The realization filled her with quiet pride rather than excitement. Her family had not simply owned a store. They had helped build the community around it. They continued sorting through the cedar chest. One notebook contained volunteer schedules for repairing bridges after floods. Another recorded donations collected for widows and orphaned children. None of the papers suggested hidden wealth. Instead, they preserved ordinary acts of kindness that had slowly shaped the town over generations. "It's strange," Noah said thoughtfully. "History books usually talk about famous people." Evelyn folded another document carefully. "These papers remember everyone else." At the bottom of the chest rested several sealed envelopes. Their paper had yellowed with age, though the wax seals had long since become brittle. Evelyn selected the smallest envelope first. Inside, she found a brief letter thanking residents for contributing lumber, food, and labor to build the community hall itself. The writer never signed the letter with a name, only the words, "On behalf of your neighbors." The second envelope contained correspondence between early town leaders discussing repairs after a severe storm. Again, nothing pointed toward treasure or scandal. Every document reflected cooperation rather than conflict. As afternoon sunlight drifted through the tall windows, Evelyn reached the final envelope, resting alone beneath the others. Unlike the previous letters, this one had been folded several times and sealed inside an additional sheet of protective paper. Across the front, someone had written in dark ink, "To those who preserve this hall." Evelyn carefully unfolded the letter. The handwriting appeared firmer than the earlier documents. "If this letter has been found," she read aloud, "then the hall has once again been placed in caring hands." Noah remained silent while she continued. The writer explained that important records had occasionally been stored inside the building whenever circumstances required additional protection. Several original documents had been removed for safekeeping during difficult years, while copies remained available for public use. The letter mentioned floods, courthouse repairs, and concerns about accidental fire, but offered few details. Near the bottom, another sentence caught Evelyn's attention. "Some records may appear incomplete because preservation required discretion." She looked thoughtfully at Noah. That sounds intentional, he nodded, like someone wanted future readers to understand why things were missing. Evelyn searched the chest one final time. There were lists of volunteers, early tax records, invitations to harvest celebrations, school committee reports, and handwritten community announcements. Yet one document everyone would have expected to find was absent. There was no original town charter. Grace Whitman arrived later that afternoon after receiving Evelyn's telephone call. She carefully examined the papers spread across the stage. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned each page. Suddenly, she paused over one of the earliest meeting records. "I know this signature," she whispered. Evelyn leaned closer. Grace pointed toward the elegant handwriting beneath the document. "Nathaniel Harper. He was one of the town's founding council members." Grace continued comparing signatures across several pages before looking up with growing excitement. "These are authentic. They're exactly what I'd hoped still existed." Evelyn smiled. "Then this chest really belonged here." Without question, Grace continued examining the final letter addressed to future caretakers. As she reached the closing paragraph, her expression changed. She silently reread one sentence before handing the page to Evelyn. "Read the last line." Evelyn lowered her eyes to the bottom of the page. The final sentence stood alone beneath everything else. Written more boldly than the surrounding text, she quietly read the words aloud. "The charter was never lost." Silence settled over the old community hall. Noah looked from the letter to the nearly empty cedar chest. Grace slowly removed her glasses, staring at the sentence as though seeing a forgotten memory return after many decades. If the writer had spoken the truth, then the town's greatest historical document had never disappeared at all. It had simply been waiting for someone to ask the right question. The words at the bottom of the letter stayed with Evelyn Brooks long after Grace Whitman and Noah Ellis finished reading the documents again. The charter was never lost. For generations, the town had accepted the same explanation. The original town charter had supposedly disappeared in a courthouse fire decades earlier, leaving only certified copies behind. No one questioned the story because no evidence suggested otherwise. Yet the letter resting inside the cedar chest quietly claimed something entirely different. Early the next morning, Evelyn carefully packed every document into archival folders borrowed from Grace. None of them wanted the fragile papers exposed to unnecessary sunlight or moisture. Together they drove to the county records office, where Sheriff Daniel Price had agreed to meet them. Although retired, Daniel had spent years helping preserve local records and knew the town's history better than almost anyone. He greeted them warmly before leading them into a small archive room lined with shelves of aging ledgers and property books. "Grace told me you've uncovered something interesting," he said. Evelyn handed him the letter. Daniel adjusted his glasses and read every word without interruption. When he reached the final sentence, he slowly looked up. "Well," he said quietly, "that's certainly unexpected." Grace folded her hands. "We've always believed the original charter was destroyed." Daniel nodded. "That's what every official record says." Evelyn placed the meeting minutes and early community records beside the letter. If these documents remained hidden inside the community hall, maybe other records were protected the same way. Daniel considered the possibility before walking towards several shelves marked Town Records. He removed thick binders containing certified copies of early legal documents. For nearly 2 hours, the four of them compared signatures, dates, and official seals. Daniel carefully examined the handwriting on the meeting records against known signatures preserved in county archives. Every comparison matched perfectly. "These are genuine," he concluded. "There's no question." Grace smiled with quiet satisfaction. "I thought so." They then turned their attention to the surviving copy of the town charter kept in the archive. Daniel carefully laid it beside the early meeting records. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. The signatures appeared authentic. The language matched other documents from the same period, yet as they examined the paper more closely, Grace noticed a small notation written near the lower corner. "This wasn't written by the founders," she said. Daniel leaned closer. "You're right." The notation identified the document as a certified duplicate prepared years after the town had already been established. Evelyn looked from one document to the other. "So this isn't the original?" Daniel slowly shook his head. "No, it's an official replacement copy." Grace looked thoughtful. "Then someone deliberately prepared another version, which means the original still existed when this one was made," Daniel added. Evelyn felt another piece of the puzzle settle into place. The letter had not exaggerated. It simply stated the truth. The charter had never disappeared when people believed it had. They continued searching through storage boxes filled with correspondence between county officials. Most contained routine maintenance reports, election notices, and financial statements. Nothing explained where the original charter had gone. Instead, they repeatedly found references to certified copies replacing earlier documents whenever originals were placed into protected storage. Daniel finally leaned back in his chair. "There was no conspiracy here." Evelyn looked at him. "What do you mean?" "Everything was documented honestly. They simply didn't record where certain originals were stored." Grace nodded slowly. "Probably because storage locations changed over time." Before leaving the records office, Daniel produced one final folder labeled Municipal Buildings. Inside were renovation permits, maintenance requests, and architectural sketches for the community hall, dating back many decades. Most pages described repairs to windows, roofing, and foundations. Near the bottom of the folder, Evelyn unfolded a large, hand-drawn floor plan showing every level of the building. Noah immediately stepped closer. "This isn't the current layout." Daniel smiled faintly. "It's the original construction drawing." Evelyn studied the blueprint carefully. Several rooms had been remodeled through the years, but one detail immediately stood out. A narrow staircase extended above the main ceiling toward a small attic storage space that no longer appeared on modern building plans. Someone had circled the attic in faded red pencil many years earlier. There were no notes explaining why. Grace traced the outline gently with one finger. "I don't remember anyone mentioning an attic." Noah frowned thoughtfully. "I've repaired the roof from outside, but I never noticed an access hatch." Daniel rolled the blueprint closed and handed it to Evelyn. "If you're following the history of this building, I'd start there." Late that afternoon, Evelyn and Noah returned to the community hall, carrying the old floor plan. They walked slowly through the quiet building, comparing walls, windows, and support beams with the original drawing. Everything matched until they reached the stage. Noah climbed onto a ladder to inspect the ceiling above the speaker's podium. After brushing away years of dust near one corner, he paused. "Evelyn," he called softly, "I think I've found something." She climbed the first few steps of the ladder and looked where he pointed. Barely visible between two ceiling beams was the outline of a square wooden hatch, almost perfectly hidden beneath layers of old paint. It blended so completely into the ceiling that no one standing on the floor would ever have noticed it. Evelyn unfolded the faded blueprint one more time. The marked attic space sat directly above the place where they now stood. Whatever the original builders intended to keep there had remained undisturbed for generations. The following morning, Noah Ellis returned with a taller ladder, fresh work gloves, and a portable work light. Evelyn Brooks had already cleared the stage beneath the hidden ceiling hatch, carefully moving the speaker's podium aside to create enough room. Grace Whitman arrived a few minutes later, carrying archival boxes. Convinced that anything hidden above the hall deserved immediate protection from dust and sunlight before climbing. Noah studied the faded blueprint one final time. "If this drawing is accurate," he said, "the attic isn't very large." Evelyn nodded. large enough to hide something important. Noah carefully pushed against the square outline concealed beneath old paint. At first, the wooden hatch refused to move. After several gentle attempts, it suddenly shifted with a dull scrape, releasing a shower of dust that drifted through the sunlight. He lowered the panels slowly and looked into the dark opening above. "There's room," he called down. "Not much, but enough." Flashlight in hand, he climbed through the narrow opening. The others waited quietly below. A minute later, his voice echoed softly from above. "There's a walkway between the roof beams." Evelyn could hear him moving carefully across old wooden planks. "Take your time," she said. "The wood's dry but still solid." Noah replied. After another moment, he added, "I found several boxes." Grace exchanged a hopeful glance with Evelyn. Noah passed down the first box using a rope they had brought for safety. It was lighter than expected, covered with decades of dust, but still intact. Evelyn placed it gently on a folding table before opening the lid. Inside rested neatly organized bundles of correspondence wrapped in brown paper. Every packet carried handwritten labels identifying neighborhood committees, fundraising events, and volunteer projects. Grace smiled as she carefully unfolded the first bundle. "These are committee reports from the early years." Evelyn turned several pages. Residents had documented repairs to bridges, plans for community picnics, donations collected after storms, and schedules for maintaining public buildings. Once again, the papers reflected ordinary people working together rather than dramatic historical events. Noah lowered a second box. This one contained dozens of black and white photographs, carefully separated by sheets of wax paper. Evelyn smiled as familiar scenes emerged one after another. Families standing outside the community hall during harvest festivals, school children waving small American flags during parades, choir performances on the very stage where she now stood. Several photographs showed Brooks' General Store decorated for holiday celebrations. Evelyn quietly touched one image, showing her grandfather handing bags of flour to local families after a difficult winter. She had never seen the picture before. Grace looked over her shoulder. "Your grandfather believed the store belonged to the town as much as your family." Evelyn nodded softly. "He always said neighbors kept each other going." More photographs revealed the same spirit. Volunteers repairing fences after floods, children planting trees around the community hall, residents sharing meals during difficult harvest seasons. None appeared staged. They simply recorded everyday acts of community. By midday, Noah climbed back down carrying the final wooden box. Unlike the others, it showed signs of careful craftsmanship. Brass corners protected the edges, and the lid fit tightly despite its age. Evelyn opened it slowly. Inside lay stacks of folded meeting programs, handwritten speeches, newspaper clippings, and several personal letters exchanged between early town leaders. She searched carefully through every bundle. There was still no original town charter. Noah climbed down from the ladder completely and brushed dust from his shirt. "That's everything up there." Evelyn looked once more inside the nearly empty box. "The charter isn't here." Grace remained calm. "No, but everything else was preserved with extraordinary care." They spent the afternoon organizing the newly discovered materials across long tables inside the hall. Many papers filled small gaps in the town's history, but none contradicted what they had already learned. The community hall had always served as the heart of local life. People gathered there to solve problems together, celebrate successes, and help neighbors through hardship. The documents strengthened the story rather than changing it. Later that afternoon, another vehicle stopped outside. Amelia Ross, chair of the town council, stepped through the front door after hearing rumors that important historical records had been discovered. She greeted everyone politely before looking around the hall, now filled with carefully arranged photographs and documents. "I had no idea there was this much history left inside," she admitted. Evelyn smiled. "Neither did I." Amelia slowly walked past the display tables. "You've done remarkable work in only a short time." After several minutes, she turned back toward Evelyn. "I'd like to make you an offer." Noah quietly stepped aside while the two women spoke. "The council originally sold the building because we couldn't afford the repairs," Amelia explained. "But if these discoveries continue, perhaps the town should own the hall again." Evelyn listened without interrupting. Amelia continued, "We could reimburse your purchase price and assume responsibility for restoring the building." The proposal was sincere rather than forceful. Evelyn appreciated that. She looked around the hall before answering. "I understand why you're asking." Amelia nodded. "This place belongs to everyone." Evelyn smiled gently. "Exactly. Which is why I don't think selling it back is the right answer yet." Amelia looked surprised. "Why not?" Evelyn rested one hand on the old cedar chest, recovered beneath the speaker's podium. "Because we're still learning its story. Until we understand everything these records are trying to tell us, I think the hall needs someone focused on preserving it rather than managing it." After a thoughtful silence, Amelia smiled. "I can't argue with that." She extended her hand. "Then let me know how the council can help instead." Evelyn shook her hand warmly. "I will." As evening approached, Grace suggested showing the newly discovered documents to Henry Cole, the oldest resident in town. "If anyone recognizes these papers," she said, "it's Henry." The three of them carried several carefully protected folders to the small retirement cottage where the 89-year-old man had lived for many years. Henry welcomed them with the quiet smile of someone who enjoyed unexpected visitors. His eyesight had weakened with age, but his memory remained remarkably sharp. Evelyn spread several photographs across the kitchen table. Henry recognized faces almost immediately, quietly sharing names and small stories connected to each image. Then Grace handed him one of the personal letters recovered from the attic. Henry unfolded it slowly. Before reading even half the page, his hands began to tremble. Tears filled his eyes as he stared at the familiar handwriting. He lowered the letter carefully onto the table, closed his eyes for a long moment, and whispered, "I never thought I'd see this again." Henry Cole held the faded letter with both hands, as though it might disappear if he loosened his grip. Evelyn Brooks, Grace Whitman, and Noah Ellis remained quietly seated around the small kitchen table. Giving the elderly man time to collect his thoughts, after several moments, Henry carefully folded the letter again and rested it on the table. "My father showed me this handwriting once," he said softly. "I was just a boy." Grace leaned forward gently. "Do you remember who wrote it?" Henry nodded. "Nathaniel Harper, one of the town founders." Evelyn exchanged a glance with Grace. They had already seen Harper's signature on the earliest meeting records hidden beneath the community hall. "Did your father ever talk about these letters?" Evelyn asked. Henry smiled faintly. "Not often. People of his generation believed some stories belonged to those who had lived them." He looked toward the window, where late afternoon sunlight stretched across the quiet yard. But every now and then, usually after community gatherings, he'd mention one thing. He paused. He always said the town's greatest promise never left the community hall. None of them interrupted. Henry's voice remained calm, but carried the careful rhythm of someone reaching back through decades of memory. "As children, we heard all sorts of stories about the original town charter. Some people claimed it burned in the courthouse fire. Others thought it had been stolen during an old property dispute. My father would simply smile and say, 'Neither story is true.'" Evelyn remembered the final sentence from the letter found inside the cedar chest. The charter was never lost. Hearing Henry repeat the same idea from childhood memories made those words feel even more believable. "Did he ever explain?" Noah asked. Henry slowly shook his hand. "Only that the founders believed some things should remain with the community itself, not with government offices that could be damaged by fire or forgotten through time." Grace nodded thoughtfully. "That matches everything we've been finding." Henry reached for the letter once more. "My father never sounded frightened when he talked about it. He sounded proud." Evelyn smiled gently. "Proud of what?" "That ordinary people could be trusted." Silence settled over the room as everyone reflected on those simple words. Since buying the abandoned community hall, Evelyn had uncovered meeting records, photographs, committee reports, volunteer lists, personal letters, and stories of neighbors helping one another through difficult times. Every discovery pointed toward the same truth. The town's history had never been built around powerful individuals. It had been built around trust shared by ordinary families. Henry continued, "People today think the charter was valuable because it was old." He looked toward Evelyn. "The founders valued it because it represented a promise." Grace quietly unfolded one of the copied meeting records. "That sounds very much like Nathaniel Harper." Henry smiled. "He believed buildings, businesses, and even people would eventually pass away. Only shared responsibility could keep a town alive." Evelyn thought about Brooks' General Store. She had spent weeks mourning the loss of the family business, believing its closing meant the end of her family's contribution to the community. Yet perhaps her grandfather had understood something she was only beginning to learn. Serving a town had never depended entirely on owning a store. Henry slowly leaned back in his chair. "One more thing." Everyone looked toward him. "My father once mentioned workers carrying a heavy wooden box during repairs at the community hall." Noah immediately paid closer attention. "Repairs?" Henry nodded. "Many years ago, I couldn't have been older than 10. His brow furrowed as he searched his memory. "There had been water damage after a storm. Several volunteers repaired part of the building." Grace asked softly, "What happened to the box?" Henry closed his eyes for a moment before answering. "I remember asking what was inside." A small smile crossed his face. "My father said, 'Something that belongs to everyone.'" Evelyn felt her heartbeat quicken. "Did he say where they took it?" Henry remained silent for several long seconds. Finally, he opened his eyes again. "Not upstairs." Noah looked puzzled. "What do you mean?" Henry pointed gently downward toward the floor. "Down." The room became completely quiet. Henry continued carefully. "The hall had a small basement storage area back then. Hardly anyone used it except during repairs." Grace looked surprised. "The current basement is much smaller than the original plans suggested." Noah nodded slowly. "Several walls were added during renovations decades ago." Henry smiled faintly. "That's right." He tapped one finger lightly against the old letter. "I remember watching the men carry the box down the stairs before they sealed part of the storage room during the repairs." Evelyn looked at Noah. Neither needed to say what both were already thinking. The hidden attic had preserved one part of the town's history. Perhaps another forgotten space still waited below. Henry's expression softened. "Don't expect treasure," he said quietly. "My father always laughed whenever children imagined gold hidden inside." Evelyn smiled. "We're not looking for treasure anymore." Henry nodded approvingly. "Good, because what those people cared about couldn't be measured that way." As evening approached, they thanked Henry for sharing everything he remembered before leaving. Evelyn gently squeezed his hand. "You've helped us more than you know." Henry smiled warmly. "You're doing exactly what the founders hoped someone would do one day." The drive back to the community hall passed mostly in thoughtful silence. The autumn sun dipped lower behind the trees as Noah carefully considered the building's structure. If the basement was remodeled, he finally said, there could easily be a sealed storage space behind one of the later walls. Grace looked at the original blueprint spread across Evelyn's lap. The plans show a larger foundation than what we can access today. Evelyn traced one corner of the drawing with her finger. Then tomorrow we start downstairs. She looked through the windshield toward the familiar silhouette of the community hall waiting at the edge of town. The attic had preserved the voices of the community. If Henry's memory was correct, the basement might still be protecting the promise those voices had been trying to preserve all along. The next morning, Evelyn Brooks unlocked the community hall before sunrise. The quiet building felt different now. Every discovery had transformed it from an abandoned structure into a place that still carried unfinished responsibilities. Noah Ellis arrived a few minutes later with masonry tools, a flashlight, and the original blueprint rolled beneath one arm. Grace Whitman followed, carrying archival boxes, while Sheriff Daniel Price joined them shortly afterward to document anything they might uncover. "Let's begin with the basement," Noah said. They descended the narrow wooden staircase beneath the stage. The basement was cool, dry, and surprisingly clean, despite years of neglect. Most of the space contained little more than old tables, broken chairs, and shelves filled with empty paint cans left behind during renovations decades earlier. Evelyn unfolded the original blueprint across a workbench, while Daniel compared it with a modern maintenance drawing borrowed from the town archives. The difference became obvious almost immediately. "This wall shouldn't be here," Noah said, pointing toward a long brick partition built across one corner of the basement. According to the original plan, an additional storage room extended beyond it. Grace looked around thoughtfully. Henry remembered a larger basement. Noah walked slowly along the brick wall, tapping each section gently with the wooden handle of his hammer. Most of the bricks produced a solid sound until he reached the far corner nearest the foundation. The tone changed noticeably. He tapped again. Hollow. Daniel stepped closer. "That definitely sounds different." Noah carefully examined the mortar between the bricks. Unlike the older foundation, this section had been built with newer materials. "This wall wasn't part of the original building," he said. "It was added later." Evelyn rested one hand against the cool brick surface. "Then whatever was behind it stayed hidden on purpose." Noah worked patiently, removing several loose bricks without damaging the surrounding structure. Dust drifted through the flashlight beams as a narrow opening gradually appeared. After clearing enough space to look inside, he aimed the flashlight into the darkness. "There's another room," he said quietly. One by one, they stepped through the opening. The hidden storage space measured only a few yards across, but it remained remarkably dry. Wooden shelves lined one wall, while several trunks and storage crates rested neatly against the far side. Everything had been arranged with care before the entrance was sealed. Grace smiled softly. Someone wanted this room protected, not forgotten. Evelyn approached the nearest shelf first. Folded American flags rested inside acid-free wrapping paper that had yellowed with age. Beside them stood framed photographs from early town celebrations, still protected beneath cloth covers. Daniel carefully lifted one frame. It showed the dedication ceremony for the community hall more than a century earlier. "I've never seen this photograph," he said quietly. The next crate contained ceremonial banners carried during parades, handwritten programs from town anniversaries, and records of civic organizations that had once met inside the hall. Evelyn noticed that everything reflected the same pattern she had seen throughout the building. Nothing celebrated individual achievement. Every item honored shared work and community service. Noah pointed toward the far corner. "There's one more container."
Resting on a sturdy wooden table stood a long copper document tube sealed with a threaded cap. Time had darkened the metal,
but it remained free of rust. Evelyn carefully lifted it. It was surprisingly heavy. Grace held her breath. Daniel quietly removed a pair of cotton gloves from his pocket. "Let's do this carefully." Noah unscrewed the cap with slow, steady pressure. After a brief resistance, it loosened. Evelyn gently tilted the tube until a tightly rolled parchment wrapped in protective linen slid into her waiting hands. No one spoke. She carefully unfolded the outer cloth first. Beneath it rested a large parchment tied with faded blue ribbon. Across the ribbon lay an intact wax seal bearing the original emblem of the town. Grace stared at it in disbelief. "The seal," she whispered. "It's never been broken." Daniel adjusted his glasses, examining the wax without touching it. "This isn't a copy." Evelyn looked at the aged parchment resting in her hands. Even before opening it, she knew what they had found. The careful storage, the protective wrapping, and the untouched seal matched every clue they had followed since the first letter inside the cedar chest declared that the charter had never been lost. Noah smiled quietly. "You found it." Evelyn's eyes filled with emotion. Weeks earlier, she had walked away from the last day of her family's store, believing everything important in her life had ended. Now she stood inside a forgotten room beneath the community hall, holding something generations had searched for without success. She slowly lifted the ribbon just enough to reveal the edge of the parchment beneath. The wax seal remained perfectly preserved, untouched since the day it had been placed there by the town's earliest leaders. Grace covered her mouth with one hand. Daniel nodded with quiet certainty. The original town charter, none of them reached to open it. For several long moments, they simply stood together in respectful silence, understanding they were looking at a promise that had waited more than a century for someone to find it exactly where its caretakers had intended. Evelyn Brooks carried the copper document tube upstairs with both hands, moving slowly as though every step mattered. Noah Ellis walked beside her, clearing a path through the community hall, while Grace Whitman and Sheriff Daniel Price followed close behind. Sunlight streamed through the repaired windows, falling across the large table where the earlier discoveries had already been carefully arranged. Daniel unfolded a clean cotton cloth before Evelyn gently placed the tube in its center. For several moments, no one reached toward it. The room remained completely still. Grace finally broke the silence. "However this was preserved," she said quietly, "the people who sealed it wanted it opened with respect." Daniel nodded. Wearing cotton gloves, he carefully examined the unbroken wax seal. The town's original emblem remained sharply impressed despite its age. He compared it with certified copies kept in the county archives before looking up with quiet confidence. "The seal is authentic." Noah released a slow breath. "So this really is the original?" Daniel nodded again. "Everything we found supports that conclusion." Evelyn carefully untied the faded ribbon without disturbing the seal more than necessary. The old wax separated gently after more than a century, not because it had been broken carelessly, but because time itself had finally completed the promise its makers had intended. She slowly unrolled the parchment across the table while everyone leaned closer. Beautiful handwriting stretched across the page, accompanied by elegant signatures and the official founding date of the town. Grace immediately recognized Nathaniel Harper's signature from the meeting records hidden beneath the speaker's podium. "It's exactly the same," she whispered. Daniel examined every signature one by one. "All original." Evelyn read the opening paragraphs aloud. The charter described the establishment of the town, the responsibilities of elected leaders, the protection of shared public spaces, and the commitment to maintain schools, roads, and gathering places for future generations. Every section reflected practical planning rather than political ambition. The founders repeatedly emphasized cooperation instead of authority. Noah smiled quietly. It sounds exactly like the people we've been discovering through all the other records. Evelyn nodded. Everything matches. Grace turned to the certified duplicate they had borrowed from the county archives. Line by line, they compared it with the newly discovered original. The wording remained almost identical. Only a few small differences appeared where later clerks had modernized spelling or clarified punctuation. There were no missing laws, no hidden ownership claims, no secret inheritance. Daniel carefully closed the duplicate. This answers the biggest question. Evelyn looked toward him. The original wasn't stolen. No. He rested one hand gently beside the parchment. Someone created an official duplicate for everyday use while protecting the original here. Grace smiled softly. Exactly what the letter beneath the stage suggested. They continued reading through the remaining pages. Near the end, another short paragraph explained the decision more directly. Following several courthouse fires in neighboring counties and growing concerns over accidental loss, the founders agreed that the original charter should remain inside the community hall whenever possible, because they believed the building belonged to the people rather than any particular office. Public business could continue using certified copies while the original remained protected for future generations. Evelyn looked thoughtfully around the hall. They never wanted anyone to lose it. They wanted to make sure everyone could keep it, Grace replied. Daniel folded his hands together. There was never a conspiracy, just careful planning. The realization brought unexpected relief. Throughout her search, Evelyn had never uncovered betrayal, greed, or conflict. Instead, every discovery revealed ordinary people quietly protecting something they loved. The hidden compartment beneath the podium, the attic archives, the sealed basement room, and now the original charter, all reflected the same steady pattern of trust. Amelia Ross arrived later that afternoon after Daniel called to share the news. She stood silently beside the table, studying the original parchment with obvious respect. I spent years believing the charter had burned, she admitted. Most of us did, Grace replied gently. Amelia looked around the community hall, now filled with carefully preserved records and photographs. I'm beginning to understand why you refused to sell the building back. Evelyn smiled. The hall wasn't hiding treasure. It was protecting history, Amelia finished quietly. She looked once more at the charter before turning toward the town records spread across the tables. The council needs to know everything you found. Daniel nodded in agreement. And we can finally explain exactly why the original disappeared from public view without inventing stories that were never true. As evening approached, Evelyn carefully continued reading the final portion of the charter. Most of the remaining text repeated legal language already preserved in the certified copy. Then she noticed something unusual. At the very end of the parchment, below the final signatures and outside the formal document itself, appeared several lines written in different ink and slightly smaller handwriting. They had not been copied into the official duplicate. Grace adjusted her glasses. That wasn't part of the legal text. Daniel leaned closer. It looks handwritten after the charter was completed. Noah remained silent as Evelyn slowly read the unexpected passage. The brief note was addressed not to officials or future councils, but to whoever might someday care for the original document. It was not a law, an amendment, or a legal instruction. It was a personal message left by the town's founders. Evelyn stopped reading halfway through and looked up. Her eyes filled with quiet emotion. Grace noticed immediately. What is it? Evelyn gently rested her fingertips against the final lines before looking back down at the parchment, whatever those handwritten words said. They had never appeared in any official record the town had preserved, and for more than a century they had remained hidden with the original charter. waiting for the first new reader to discover them. The handwritten note at the bottom of the original town charter remained on Evelyn Brooks's mind throughout the evening. It was not written in the formal language of laws or official declarations. Instead, it spoke directly to future caretakers with remarkable warmth. This town will endure only as long as its people choose one another over themselves. Buildings will age, businesses will close, and generations will pass. But a community survives when ordinary neighbors continue the promises others began. When Evelyn finished reading the words aloud, no one in the community hall spoke for several moments. Grace Whitman quietly removed her glasses to wipe away tears. Sheriff Daniel Price looked down at the parchment with deep respect. Noah Ellis smiled gently. "That may be the most important part of the whole document." Amelia Ross nodded. "And almost no one ever knew it existed." The following morning, Daniel completed the official authentication paperwork, confirming that the recovered charter matched the certified duplicate preserved in county records while containing the original signature's seal and handwritten closing message absent from later copies. Grace carefully documented every supporting discovery, including the meeting records, letters, photographs, and construction plans explaining how the charter had been protected inside the community hall. By the end of the day, there was no remaining doubt. The original document had never disappeared through theft or fire. It had simply been preserved exactly as the founders intended. News spread quickly through town. Amelia announced that an open community gathering would be held inside the restored hall, so every resident could hear the complete story directly from those who had uncovered it. Volunteers immediately offered to clean the building, arrange chairs, prepare refreshments, and help welcome visitors. Watching neighbors work side by side reminded Evelyn of the committee records she had spent days reading. More than a century had passed, yet the spirit recorded in those faded pages still quietly existed. On Saturday afternoon, families filled the community hall until nearly every chair was occupied. Children sat beside grandparents. Former residents returned from neighboring counties after hearing of the discovery. Framed photographs lined the walls while copies of the recovered letters and meeting records rested beneath protective displays. At the center of the stage stood the original town charter inside a temporary glass case. Grace welcomed everyone before introducing Sheriff Daniel, who briefly explained how the document had been authenticated. He carefully described the certified duplicate, the original signatures, and the evidence showing that no theft or conspiracy had ever occurred. "History was never stolen from this town," he concluded. "It was carefully protected by people who believed future generations deserved the chance to understand where they came from." Quiet applause filled the hall. Grace then spoke about the volunteers, families, and ordinary citizens whose names appeared throughout the recovered records. She reminded everyone that the greatest discoveries were not hidden fortunes, but simple acts of generosity preserved on paper. Finally, Amelia invited Evelyn to the stage. Evelyn looked across the familiar room, remembering childhood Christmas concerts, school plays, wedding receptions, and community dinners held beneath the same roof. Only weeks earlier, she had walked away from Brooks General Store, believing her years of serving the town had come to an end. Now she understood they had merely taken a different form. She rested one hand gently beside the glass case holding the charter. "When I bought this building for $100, she began, many people believed I had spent my last savings on something that no longer mattered. A few quiet smiles appeared throughout the audience. The truth is, I thought I was buying an old building. Instead, I inherited the story of a community." She described discovering the hidden compartment beneath the speaker's podium, the cedar chest, the attic archives, Henry Cole's memories, the sealed basement room, and finally the original charter. She explained that every clue pointed toward the same lesson. The founders never intended to hide history forever. They intended to protect it until someone cared enough to preserve it properly again. Evelyn then read the handwritten closing message from the charter exactly as it appeared on the parchment. When she reached the final sentence, many people quietly wiped tears from their eyes. The words did not celebrate power, wealth, or success. They celebrated neighbors choosing one another through every generation. Henry Cole slowly stood from the front row, supported by his cane. He smiled warmly at the crowd. "My father used to tell me that promises live longer than people," he said. "Today I finally understand what he meant." The room answered with gentle applause. Families remained afterward, studying photographs, recognizing familiar names, and sharing stories passed down through generations. Children pointed excitedly toward pictures of great-grandparents they had never seen before. Former classmates reunited after years apart. Conversations filled every corner of the community hall with laughter once again. As evening approached, Amelia quietly gathered the members of the town council near the front of the hall. After a brief private discussion, she returned to the stage carrying a folder. "Before everyone leaves," she announced, "the council has one final matter to decide." The room gradually grew silent. Amelia looked toward Evelyn before opening the folder containing the official agenda. "Tonight we will vote on the future of the community hall." The community hall grew quiet as Amelia Ross stood before the gathered residents holding the town council's folder. Families who had spent the afternoon sharing stories and studying old photographs now turned their attention toward the stage. Evelyn Brooks remained beside the display case, protecting the original town charter. Her hands folded calmly before her. She had never imagined that buying an abandoned building for $100 would lead to this moment. Amelia looked around the room before speaking. For many years, the council believed selling this building was the most responsible decision. The roof leaked, repairs were expensive, and we thought the hall had outlived its purpose. She paused, glancing toward the recovered photographs lining the walls. We were wrong. Quiet smiles spread through the audience. Over the past several weeks, Amelia continued, this building has reminded us that a community cannot measure value only by budgets or maintenance costs. Some places deserve to be preserved because they tell us who we are. She opened the folder and read the council's official resolution. The community hall would no longer be considered surplus property. Instead, it would receive permanent recognition as a protected local historical landmark. The council would withdraw every previous plan to sell or demolish the building. Restoration funds would be approved. Volunteers would continue assisting with preservation, and the hall would become a permanent home for the documents, photographs, and stories recovered during Evelyn's search. Applause filled the room. It lasted much longer than Evelyn expected. She looked toward Noah Ellis, who smiled proudly from the back of the hall, then toward Grace Whitman, whose eyes shimmered with quiet satisfaction. Sheriff Daniel Price nodded respectfully, knowing the history he had spent years protecting would now remain where it belonged. When the applause finally settled, Amelia stepped down from the stage and walked directly toward Evelyn. "This belongs to you," she said, handing her the framed resolution signed by every council member. Evelyn accepted it gently before shaking her hand. "No," she replied with a warm smile. "It belongs here." She carefully placed the resolution beside the recovered meeting records, rather than taking it for herself. The audience answered with another round of applause. During the weeks that followed, the community hall slowly returned to life. Local carpenters repaired damaged beams while volunteers painted walls, restored windows, and refinished the old wooden stage. Children helped clean the surrounding grounds. Retired teachers cataloged documents beside Grace Whitman. Sheriff Daniel supervised the transfer of historical records into proper archival storage. Noah spent long evenings rebuilding the front porch where generations of families had once gathered before community celebrations. No one asked to be paid for extra hours. They simply arrived each morning ready to help. Watching neighbors work together reminded Evelyn of the handwritten committee records hidden inside the cedar chest. More than a century later, the same spirit still quietly existed. One afternoon, Noah approached Evelyn, carrying a carefully restored wooden sign he had discovered in basement storage. The faded lettering read simply, Community Hall. "Think it should go back where it belongs?" he asked. Evelyn smiled. "Absolutely." Together, they lifted it above the front entrance, exactly where it had hung decades earlier. Across town, another unexpected tribute quietly took shape. Several residents suggested that Brooks General Store should not disappear from local memory simply because the building had closed. Families donated photographs, old receipts, advertisements, grocery lists, and stories collected across 3 generations. One corner of the restored community hall became a permanent exhibit celebrating the little store that had served the town for more than 90 years. Evelyn stood silently before the display the first time it opened. There was the original wooden nameplate that had hung above her register. Beside it rested her grandfather's handwritten ledger, photographs of holiday window displays, newspaper clippings, and smiling customers gathered outside during anniversary celebrations. A small plaque beneath the exhibit read, "Brooks General Store, serving neighbors before customers." Evelyn smiled through quiet tears. The store had closed, but its story had found a new home. Months later, the community hall officially reopened with a celebration attended by nearly everyone in town. Music once again filled the restored stage. School children performed songs where Evelyn had once stood as a little girl. Local families shared homemade meals along long tables, exactly as earlier generations had done. Visitors wandered through the exhibits reading the recovered meeting minutes, letters, photographs, and committee records. Again and again, people paused before the original town charter, displayed safely inside a climate-controlled glass case at the center of the hall. Beside it rested a copy of the handwritten message left by the founders, reminding every visitor that a town survives only when its people continue choosing one another. Amelia quietly approached Evelyn during the celebration. "I used to think preserving buildings meant protecting old wood and bricks," she admitted. "Now I understand we're really protecting relationships." Evelyn nodded. "That's what this place always held." Henry Cole attended the reopening despite his age, smiling as children filled the hall with laughter once more. Grace spent hours answering questions from curious visitors. Daniel watched several young students carefully studying the early records, pleased to see history becoming something alive instead of forgotten paperwork. Noah looked around the crowded room before quietly saying to Evelyn, "Seems like the hall finally got its community back." "I think the community found its hall again," she answered. As evening settled over the town and the last visitors slowly made their way home, Evelyn remained behind to straighten chairs and quietly tidy the exhibits. The building had become peaceful once more, though no longer lonely. She walked slowly through every room, pausing beside the restored stage. The attic hatch now carefully preserved, and the basement entrance where the sealed storage room had waited so patiently through the passing generations. Finally, she stopped before the glass case holding the original town charter. She unlocked the case, carefully lifted the parchment just long enough to complete its routine inspection, then returned it to its place with gentle hands. Beside it, she arranged the meeting records, the cedar chest, the photographs, and the letters that had guided every step of her journey, before locking the case again. Evelyn rested her hand lightly against the glass and read the founder's handwritten promise one final time. She realized that losing Brooks General Store had never been the end of her purpose. and it simply led her toward another way of serving the same town her family had loved for generations. She switched off the lights, walked to the front entrance, and looked back across the quiet hall, glowing softly beneath the evening lamps. The community hall no longer stood as an abandoned building rescued from demolition. It had become the living heart of the town once again. With a peaceful smile, Evelyn locked the front door, slipped the old brass key into her pocket, and walked into the cool evening, knowing that some legacies are not inherited through wealth, but through the simple decision to care for the people and places that make a community feel like home.